free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Good afternoon. You're watching The Discussion with me, Inaya Folarin Iman, where we discuss the big moral, cultural and political questions of our time. We've got a packed show for you today. Thought policing within our most important institutions, radical Islam, free speech and the West. And as the cost of living crisis balloons, have the left given up on economic justice? And also, has the pandemic killed populism? All that and much more coming up. But first, here's the bulletins.
Good afternoon, it's 1 minute past 3 o'clock. I'm Simon Pusey in the GB newsroom. Downing Street says an MP who claims she was sacked because of her Muslimness was invited to make a formal complaint but failed to do so. Nusrat Ghani lost her job as Transport Minister in 2020. The Prime Minister then spoke to her after learning of the extremely serious allegation. Chief Whip Mark Spencer has also spoken out to deny the claims, saying he considers her remarks defamatory. Here's what the Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab had to say.
I believe actions, a claim like this, as serious as this, should, but it can only happen if the person making the complaint makes it formally. That's when the procedures kick in. And just to be clear about this, that advice was given to Nuz back in 2020.
The chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Tom Tugendhat, says he's good friends with Ms Ghani and has no reason to doubt her claims.
I've always found her words to be true. So let's investigate this, because I think it's a very serious allegation. As you and I both know, we're stronger when we draw on the full talents of the team, and we're very lucky in the United Kingdom to have people from communities around the world, and that enriches our society and enriches our skills and our reach. So I hope very much this can be answered quickly, and if there is a question to answer, that it's dealt with immediately.
The former Education Secretary has been accused of threatening to withdraw funds for a school after an MP considered voting against the government. Christian Wakeford, who recently defected to Labour, says he was warned to consider what he was doing before voting against a motion over free school meals. He told the Sunday Times Gavin Williamson, a former Chief Whip, had made the comment. Mr Williamson says he doesn't remember the conversation. Britain has accused the Russian president of plotting to install a pro-Moscow leader as head of the government in Ukraine. In an unusual move, the Foreign Office named the former Ukrainian MP Yevhen Murayev as a potential pro-Kremlin candidate to take over in Kiev. Foreign Secretary Liz Truss says it shines a light on the extent of Russian activity designed to subvert Ukraine. Former head of the army, Lord Richard Dannett, told GB News the West needs to work out what Putin's objective is.
We have to remember that scrape him to the core and you find an unreconstructed KGB colonel whose beloved Warsaw Pact and Soviet Union was destroyed by the cohesion of the West in 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down. And what he would like to achieve more than anything else is to sow discord and doubt amongst the minds of NATO members and break up that cohesion of NATO.
The former Housing Secretary is calling for the national insurance hike, which he approved, to be postponed. Robert Jenrick says the government is responding to the cost of living crisis lamentably slow. He added that confronting harsh realities is part of alleviating the situation for low and middle-income families. Belgian police have been firing tear gas and water cannon at protesters in Brussels. Thousands of people marched through the capital to demonstrate against COVID vaccinations and restrictions before gathering outside the European Commission. Prime Minister Alexandre De Croo announced on Friday that booster jabs will be required to maintain COVID passes, giving people access to bars or cinemas. A suspect accused of killing a British man with a sickle is being questioned by police in Thailand. The 49-year-old was found dead in his home with knife wounds. Another man, who's 55, was injured while trying to stop the suspect. Police say an initial investigation found they were attacked for playing music too loudly in the early hours of Saturday morning. A British Iranian detained in Tehran has started a hunger strike over the lack of progress in securing his release. 67-year-old Anousheh Ashuri has been held in a prison for more than 4 years, accused of spying for Israel. He denies the charges against him. His daughter Alika Ashuri, who's concerned about his health, says her father is taking the action in solidarity with other dual nationals who are also being held hostage. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens. Now let's return to the discussion.
Welcome back to the discussion. And throughout the show, tweet your views and thoughts with the hashtag #TheDiscussion. I read all of the comments and often share them on my social media, so please join the discussion. Well, today, The Telegraph reports that Sean Corby, an employee at the government-funded arbitration service, ACAS, was investigated for racism for sharing liberal articles about equality in an organisation-wide diversity and inclusion forum. Posts included quotes and articles by black writers such as Aisha Takambi, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and also, surprisingly, myself. The complaints alleged that Corby's views made them feel unsafe. The case has highlighted how well-meaning but often wrong-headed diversity and inclusion approaches are being exploited to shut down debate about race and gender policies. Well, in his first TV interview about the case, Sean Corby joins me now, and alongside him, Toby Young, General Secretary of the Free Speech Union, who has supported Sean through this case. Thank you for joining me both. Firstly, we'll speak to Toby first. Thank you for joining me this afternoon, Toby. I mean, firstly, it's been 2 years now since you created the Free Speech Union, and it's done a lot of widely known and excellent work. I mean, could you just tell me a bit more about some of the problems that are going on within our institutions in terms of ideological discrimination and often thought policing?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on, Inaya. We set up the Free Speech Union about 2 years ago, and about half of our work now is casework, dealing with individual cases, people who reach out to us for help. About half of them are students or academics, and about half are people like Sean, employees of either public sector or private sector companies. And quite often, what they want help with is someone having issued a formal complaint to their employer about the fact that they've challenged the prevailing ideological dogma within their company. And in Sean's case, that's what happened. Sean discovered, and many of our members have discovered this, that if you challenge the idea that all outcome discrepancies in our society when it comes to things like education, employment, income, housing, that all of those discrepancies between ethnic groups, if you challenge the idea that they're caused by systemic racism, fueled in large part by unconscious bias, requiring companies to spend vast sums of money on various diversity training programs, if you challenge any of that, you are identified effectively as a racist, and people will make serious complaints about you, which in some cases can result in your getting fired. So people who haven't said anything remotely unlawful, nothing that would meet the threshold of stirring up racial hatred under the Public Order Act, nothing like that, just people who put an alternative point of view. Maybe our society is not as riddled with racism from top to bottom as the diversitycrats in my company are claiming. Maybe there's more than one cause of ethnic outcome discrepancies across these various fields. Let's look at it from a multiple of perspectives, and let's bring in the voices of some dissenting black intellectuals on these issues, which is precisely what Sean wanted to do. And as a result, he then had to deal with a terrible, drawn-out, extended complaints procedure. And even though he was initially exonerated, one thing we've discovered over and over again at the Free Speech Union is that the process is the punishment. He shouldn't have had to go through this, justify himself, seen his employment jeopardized in this way, simply for expressing his perfectly lawful, perfectly legitimate, respectable point of view on what are, after all, politically contentious issues.
Well, we just want to emphasize that we're struggling to connect to Sean right now. He has some connectivity issues, but we will get him as soon as we can. I mean, Toby, what can be done about this? I mean, we have a Conservative government, and many people argue that part of the reason why they were elected was perhaps a kind of social conservatism, but they have seemingly so far been unable to stem some of the problems going on widespread within society.
Well, there are sort of three things you can do. The first is you can fight back robustly when you're put through one of these complaints procedures. And if you're a member of the Free Speech Union, we will help you do that. And we spend a lot of time helping people do that. We have a full-time chief legal counsel, a new legal officer who's with us for 4 days a week. And they spend most of their time helping people like Sean navigate these complaints procedures and make sure they don't lose their jobs and aren't penalised in any way. If that's unsuccessful, we can help employees who've lost their jobs take their employers to court. We recently took a train conductor called Jeremy Sleeth. We helped him take West Midlands trains to the Employment Tribunal. He had been fired for saying on Freedom Day, July 19th, thank God the pubs are reopening. I don't want to live in an alcohol-free Muslim caliphate for the rest of my days. Now, he said that on his private Facebook account, not in the workplace. But nonetheless, a colleague at West Midlands Trains complained, and he was dismissed for gross misconduct after one of these protracted investigations. We helped him take West Midlands Trains to the Employment Tribunal, and the Employment Tribunal found that he had been unfairly dismissed. So he won that. But there's only so much you can do, I think. In the courts or in these kangaroo courts within companies. Ultimately, I think there has to be a change to the law. And one of the things the Free Speech Union will be lobbying for is to try and persuade this government to make it so it becomes unlawful for employees to be investigated for anything they've said outside the workplace, outside office hours, anything they've said which is more than 12 months old. There has to be a statute of limitations on offence archaeology on Twitter and Facebook, with people trawling through everything people have said on social media, looking for reasons to complain about them and to get them into trouble for political reasons, not because they were genuinely offended by them or genuinely don't feel safe.
Yeah, but Toby, I mean, do you not worry of creating a kind of litigious culture of taking our employers to court, and there are a lot of these bad faith assumptions which could also be very draining? I mean, shouldn't we be trying to also be creating a culture of freedom within wider society to which people would think it's completely absurd and ridiculous to complain about somebody expressing widely held and perfectly reasonable opinions?
Well, when the Free Speech Union goes to bat for someone like Sean, what we'll do in the first instance is we'll write to the head of HR or the CEO of the company and say, look, he shouldn't be investigated for what was a good faith contribution to this conversation. You've said you want an open conversation about race. You want to consider points of view that haven't been considered before on this issue, particularly points of view from people of colour. All he was doing was suggesting that these black intellectuals and their perspective on these issues, which happens not to be the same as the diversity grants within your company, they should be considered. These voices need to be heard if we're going to have the open conversation. But that's not usually enough. You would think that most employers, heads of HR, on hearing that, on thinking about it, reflecting about it, would think, well, OK, actually, it's absurd. This complaint should just be dismissed immediately. But they don't. They feel obliged to investigate them. The investigations can last from 6 months to a year. And we found, unfortunately, Inaya, that often threatening court action is the only language they'll understand.
And finally, I mean, do you think that things need to go further? I mean, do you think that as a society we should really be looking at some of these policies and practices around diversity and inclusion, as in some ways the structure of them, the incentives around them, just make it too easy for opportunistic individuals to exploit for their own political purposes?
Absolutely. And I mean, I think there are some interesting and important conversations to be had around equity, diversity and inclusion. The problem is that those conversations have been completely dominated by just one particular perspective, the woke perspective informed by critical race theory, the perspective that maintains that our society is riddled with racism and has been for decades, and it's the legacy of colonialism and the British Empire, and we're every bit as bad as America, and so on and so forth. It's effectively an American ideology that has found its way into all sorts of companies across the public and private sector, as well as universities, museums, galleries, heritage institutions, the performing arts sector. It's a particular dogmatic ideology. And if anyone dissents from it, if anyone says, actually, there are some other points of view that should be taken into account when formulating these policies, when deciding what's gone wrong and how to have a more equitable, diverse workplace, they immediately get stamped on and smeared as racist and can end up, in some cases, losing their jobs. I think what we need to do, what people like you need to do, Inaya, is to make it clear that there is a multiplicity, a diversity of viewpoints on these important issues, and many different voices from many different political perspectives need to be heard if we're going to actually make genuine improvements to the workplace, to our universities and so forth.
No, fantastic words, Toby. Thank you so much. Toby Young, General Secretary of the Free Speech Union. I'm very glad now to be joined by Sean Corby. Thank you for joining me this afternoon, Sean. I mean, Toby, outlined very briefly your case, and it has been revealed that despite the fact that you were cleared, understandably and rightfully so, of any wrongdoing, that an appeal has been lodged continuing this process. Is that right?
Yes, that's right, yeah. But I only learned that on Friday. ACAS guidance from its code of conduct that, as you'll know, employment judges respect, clearly indicates that a appeal should be made ideally within 5 days. So why I'm only hearing about it now, I don't know, but that seems to be quite consistent with ACAS's handling of my case from the beginning, which I would argue has been very much in contravention of its own code of conduct on discipline and grievance.
And one of the things that Toby said was that the process is the punishment. I mean, do you agree with that? That even though you were cleared, it is this long and arduous and confusing and opaque process, which can be just as demoralising for people that are going through it.
Yeah, well, I've taught discipline and grievance process when I was working for the Good Practice Services team, and so I know what we charge employers to be trained in discipline and grievance and how to conduct grievance procedures like this. And from the absolute get-go, ACAS has failed to comply with its own guidance, and this has been dragged out. At first, they didn't even tell me that there was a grievance. They didn't tell me anything. The grievance only came after I submitted my grievance with support of Emma Stopford at Affinity, and that's after I'd reached out for support from the Free Speech Union, which without that support I would have been isolated and destroyed.
And I mean, how do you think this has been allowed to happen? I mean, this is obviously a very big question, but ACAS, an institution that is an arbitration service, you would assume that they would have best practices for dealing with that. But do you have any sense of how this has been allowed to happen?
I have different viewpoints on this. I think we're dealing with obviously the procedural thing. At best, it's incompetent. At worst, I think that it might be that there's a case here where certain figures in senior management have been complicit in this, either because they themselves hold this ideology, or they're being bullied by cabals of people that hold this ideology that are actually extremists that use various tactics to bully senior leadership into going along with it. And also, one of the points of me posting the articles that I did was to raise awareness amongst people of different perspectives. There is not one perspective only on any of these issues, and nobody has the right to say that they are the spokesperson on this issue. And I posted, if I was here, Inaya, and I was saying, okay, this bloke, he said something a bit borderline, but, he's married to a black woman, he's got black kids, he's socialised for most of his life with black people and lived much of his life professionally around black communities. So we'll give him the benefit of the doubt. That's not what's happened here. I've not said anything that's borderline. In fact, most of what I posted was not my thoughts anyway, although obviously I'm in agreement with them. They were posted by erudite black intellectuals, thinkers, commentators, authors and artists. And 4 members of staff have attacked me in a malicious, vicious way. And I would assert that, in fact, if they're to search their hearts, it's they who are the bigots. They could not tolerate a man who they believe to be just a white man talking about such issues. And I pretty much believe that if I'd have put up an article about, for instance, Marcus Garvey, they'd have probably been upset by that as well, because they'd have thought, what temerity has this guy got to be talking on an issue that only we are allowed to issue? And of course, they're just as cruel, just as malicious about other black people who don't hold their views, and I dare say they'd have some terrible things to say about my wife and other people that share the kind of viewpoints that I do, because I've been party to that abuse in the past.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and solidarity with you, Sean, through all of this. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. Well,
thank you.
After the break, I'll be asking, where is the left as the cost of living crisis is ballooning, with Ashley Frawley? And all that and much more right after the break.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking mostly dry but rather cloudy with some rain in the far northwest. Let's take a look at the details. The north coasts of Devon and Cornwall should see a few cloud breaks, but for most parts of southwest England, it will be a dry, albeit cloudy start to the evening. Southeast of England should also be generally dry at around 7 p.m, but here too it will be cloudy with light winds. There will be a better chance of some clear spells developing across parts of Wales, especially towards the north and west of the country. As we run eastwards back into the Midlands, the gaps in the cloud will tend to fill in, so any breaks will be restricted towards the west and northwest of the region. Slightly more in the way of a breeze is on the cards across the east of England, and this will help to break the cloud up a bit at times, giving some clear spells. Some damp and windy weather will affect the far north and west of Scotland, but further south and east a dry and breezy evening is likely with broken cloud cover. One or two cloud breaks are likely across Northern Ireland, particularly towards the north coast, but as elsewhere, the main theme will be a rather cloudy, predominantly dry one. Damp and windy weather will continue to affect the far northwest tonight. Elsewhere, it stays mostly dry and cloudy, with a slight frost forming under any clearer spells.
Join me, Nana Akweer, on Fridays, Saturdays and Sunday afternoons here on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as my panel and I take on some of the top stories hitting the headlines.
You can look up the statistics.
No, you look it up. I hug everyone I
We learn from it and try and move on. That's it.
Opinion is at the heart of the show. It's a place for open and frank conversation, but without the fear of cancellation. So join me here on GB News on Friday, Saturday and Sunday afternoons between 4 and 6 p.m.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world.
If you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
My name
is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panelists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join me, Mark White, here on GB News. For more than 2 decades, I've been at the sharp end of reporting crime and security at home and abroad. From the scourge of terrorism to the fight against violent crime and the deepening small boats crisis in the Channel, they're issues you rightly care about, and so do I. As GB News Home and Security Editor, my focus will be on the stories that matter to you.
Welcome back to the discussion, and make sure to tweet us with the hashtag #TheDiscussion. Now, spiralling energy bills, precarious low-paid employment, tax hikes, unaffordable housing and rising rents. Yes, we're in a cost of living crisis. However, whilst in the past the left was viewed as the primary vehicle to which working class people organised to improve their material conditions, in recent years this notion is being significantly challenged. Today's left are increasingly focused on cultural questions of race, gender and sexuality, rather than material questions. Indeed, over the last decade, working class people have increasingly turned towards right-wing populist parties to advocate for their material interests. Well, to explore the state of the contemporary left, let's talk to Dr. Ashley Frawley, lecturer in sociology at Swansea University. Thank you so much for joining me, Ashley. I mean, have the left given up on economics in your view?
Yeah, in terms of in a deeper sense of understanding the underlying economy, understanding the functioning of the economy, and having a criticism and an understanding of social problems that arises out of that understanding, I think that's pretty much gone now. I mean, obviously there are still pockets of this in certain places, but I think overall there's been a turn, especially since about the post-war period, more toward cultural issues. I think that was kind of spawned by the post-war boom, where instead of whereas past socialists and communists had seen production as something that could free people, something that was the basis of calling for a better life. You had Sylvia Pankhurst who said, "We call for a great production that can supply all and more than all the people can consume." Once you get into the 1960s, you have this boom and people start saying, oh, well, actually, that's the problem. Prosperity is the problem. It's not the solution. And I think since then, our ability to demand a better deal as workers and for workers has been really hit hard by that. It's become very, very difficult to recover from the kind of move toward anti-consumerism and so on. I mean, if consumption is the problem, it becomes very hard to advocate for higher wages and a better standard of living.
Yeah, just drilling down into that with a few examples. I mean, one of the ways in which I often see that is when we talk about the green agenda, for example, is often framed in the sense that growth is a negative thing, that actually we need to consume less, we need to do less, we need to basically live smaller and simpler lives. And that is quite a contrast to what was before, where actually many of our ancestors were living in scarcity for most of human history, and it was regarded as a sign of liberation and prosperity that we had abundance, we had opportunity. I mean, would you see the environmental debate as an example where you see that left discourse changing towards one that is more sceptical of consumerism and greater prosperity?
Yeah, I think there is a tendency to kind of buy into this idea that it's, well, you were just phrasing it this way, we are the problem, we consume too much, we are the drivers. I mean, that comes from a kind of economics that was designed to put down the working class and stop the working class from having a say over the economy, from demanding a better deal for themselves. It was sort of like, oh no, human beings can't possibly do that. Human beings can't possibly have a say over the economy. It's all very, very difficult. Leave it up to us. And so we have this idea where it's like, we human beings are just so bad and so terrible. How could we possibly, have a better world? Look, it's all our fault. We've demanded too much. We consume too much. When actually we can create a world as human beings using our ingenuity using technology that is much, much more prosperous, much better, and much more sustainable. We can do that. Unfortunately, we're not able to do that directly just yet. We are able to do things so long as they're profitable. So long as fossil fuels remain very, very profitable, then it becomes very difficult to develop in a sustainable way. But it's not impossible. And this whole discourse of blaming us, not only is it incorrect, it again impacts on our ability to demand more and a better deal and a better life. We need to have a deeper understanding of the economy instead of just blaming humanity. It's anti-human, and it makes it very difficult, as I said, to push for a better deal.
It's interesting, actually, because I've always been quite a optimistic person and someone that thinks about how we go beyond our current society and questioning those who may see kind of capitalism as the kind of pinnacle of human economic organization. But it is really difficult, I think, even for myself and ordinary people to feel that sense of human possibility within our current social and economic context. As I mentioned, precarious, low-paid employment, we're atomized, everything is increasingly mediated through social media and barriers to which that sense of solidarity, that sense of organizing doesn't really seem to be as easier to do as perhaps there previously was. So I guess my question is, do you understand that there are certain current social conditions which make that sense of political possibility much more difficult?
Oh, yeah. I mean, absolutely. Especially, I mean, even just the pandemic where we've all been just driven apart, it makes it much more difficult to share your disappointments with your colleagues and to organize and so on. I think, yeah, as we become more and more atomized, as we're encouraged to just be at each other's throats all the time about, you said this, and also the whole left-wing movement has really been undermined by this idea that it is progressive to try to get someone fired for what they say. Because we all know how Karl Marx was, workers of the world unite, except for the ones with dodgy ideas. I mean, what do you think was in workers' heads in the 19th century? It wasn't all progressive stuff, things that we would think of as progressive today. I mean, that was all beside the point. So now I think, there's this general impression that the left is the enemy, as opposed to someone who's going to fight for your interests. And I think that's a real issue. And we need to have a strong working class movement that advocates for the vast majority of people, that doesn't get too entangled in culture wars, and that doesn't encourage us to constantly fight against each other, point fingers at each other, and instead encourages us to see what we hold in common, which is that we all want a better future, a richer future, and it's possible.
And finally, Ashley, I mean, what do you think is the best vehicle for working class people to organise for their material interests? I think in the introduction, I talked about how, for example, many right-wing populist parties have benefited from the disillusionment with the possibility of realising a better society and people looking elsewhere. And so it does seem quite difficult to know how to and what vehicle is the best way to organise as a working class person today. What do you think?
I still think that you need to organize as workers for your interests in the workplace. But I also think that I've come to this point in my thinking where I honestly don't care if you split the vote. But we need to have a party that stands up for working people, that cuts through the nonsense, and that fights for what unites us, as I said, rather than what separates us, and that is interested in making sure that we have better wages, not just constantly lobbying the government for better welfare, although that's important. We also need to make sure that that we are having a productive society, that we are actually producing useful things that give people useful and meaningful work. I think having that kind of party that would actually represent the vast majority of people, I think there's a gaping hole of politics that's just begging to be filled. I think a lot of people vote Tory kind of holding their noses, but that because they don't see Labour as representing them anymore. I think just having that kind of party would just even if we may not win, would push things forward by leaps and bounds just by having that voice that's missing in politics at the moment.
Oh, really interesting. Thank you, Dr. Ashley Frawley, lecturer in sociology at Swansea University. Thank you for your time. Well, there's lots coming up after the break. We've got how big a problem is radical Islam within Western society, and has the pandemic killed populism? But first, as usual, here's the bulletins.
Hello, it's 3:35. I'm Simon Pusey in the GB newsroom. Downing Street says Nusrat Ghani, who claims she was sacked as Transport Minister because of her Muslimness, was invited to make a formal complaint but failed to do so. In a statement, the MP says she only wanted the government to take the matter seriously and investigate it properly. Chief Whip Mark Spencer, who spoke to Ms Ghani, has strongly denied her allegations, saying he considers her remarks defamatory. Britain has accused the Russian president of plotting to install a pro-Moscow leader as head of the government in Ukraine. In an unusual move, the Foreign Office named former Ukrainian MP Yevhen Muriev as a potential pro-Kremlin candidate to take over in Kiev. Former Secretary Liz Truss says it shines a light on the extent of Russian activity designed to subvert Ukraine. A suspect accused of killing a British man with a sickle is being questioned by police in Thailand. The 49-year-old was found dead in his home with knife wounds. Another man was injured and taken to hospital. Police say an initial investigation found they were attacked for playing music too loudly in the early hours of Saturday morning. British-Iranian Anousheh Ashuri, who's been held in a Tehran prison for more than 4 years, has started a hunger strike. The protest is over the Foreign Office's lack of progress in securing his release. The 67-year-old is accused of spying for Israel. He denies the charges against him. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to the discussion.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world.
If you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Welcome back. Well, the last few months has seen several terror attacks by Islamist extremists committed within Western society. Most recently, British-Pakistani Malik Faisal Akram attacked a Texas synagogue in what the FBI has described as an act of terrorism targeting the Jewish community. However, several observers have noted that despite being a clear and significant threat, there remains a reluctance and fear within society about having a serious discussion about the problem of Islamist radicalization within Western societies, particularly in the UK. So, how big a problem is radical Islam within Western society? What are the causes and the drivers? And are we doing enough to tackle it? Joining me now to discuss this is Yasmin Mohammed, human rights campaigner and author of Unveiled. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon, Yasmin. Firstly, just that question. I mean, how big a problem, in your view, is radical Islam within Western societies?
Well, strangely, it's getting bigger. It's getting smaller in Muslim societies, and it's getting bigger in Western societies. And part of the reason for that is Islamist groups like the Muslim Brotherhood are considered terrorist organizations in countries like Egypt and Saudi Arabia, etc. So they're aware of the threat. They understand Islamism. They understand Islamists. Whereas in the West, they do not understand it, and they are not aware of the threat. So the main problem here in the West is that there is not a clear distinction between Muslim and Islamist. People are not understanding that those are two very different groups. People are grouping them together. Now, that's understandable because every Islamist is a Muslim, but not every Muslim is an Islamist. So an Islamist essentially means a political Muslim. He's a Muslim, or she is a Muslim, who is going to use politics, use diplomatic means in order to spread Islam. So you'll have jihadis that will use terrorism to spread their religion, and you have Islamists that will use diplomatic means. And so it's very important to understand that threat. And in countries like France, for example, they're finally understanding it. Unfortunately, it took, rivers of blood before they finally started to understand it. They have such a high Muslim population there that within, once you have a Muslim population that high, you're going to have a high percentage of Islamists as well. And, it took Samuel Paty, a teacher, being beheaded in the middle of the streets of a suburb of Paris before the French government were finally, willing to put their foot down and say, okay, enough is enough. This is a real problem and we have to address it. And thankfully, they're doing some very important things like shutting down mosques that are preaching Islamist things, anti-Semitism, homophobia, things that you would, if you were in a mosque in other countries, they would be problematic there as well. So, it's important to understand that these are parts of the religion of Islam, and some Muslims believe it and some Muslims do not. But the difference is an Islamist thinks that whether you believe it or not, you have to follow Islam's rules.
Yasmin, what would drive someone, though, to actually commit acts of terrorism? On what basis are they justifying these horrendous acts?
They see themselves as freedom fighters. They see themselves as martyrs. They see themselves as heroes, as superheroes, in fact. So they feel like they are responding to the call from, the creator of the universe. So they really do feel that what they're doing is just and good. They don't see themselves as terrorists. As you know, I was married to a member of Al-Qaeda who thankfully is in prison in Egypt right now. And he didn't see himself as a bad person. He saw himself as a good person. He was proud of the terrorism that he was involved in. It's really hard to explain that level of indoctrination that to murder innocent people is considered good.
Then how do we tackle it? Because, a lot of the time when these terror attacks happen, there's so many different things happen. One will have a review of the security services and what kind of security measures needs to be put in place. We might have a discussion about unity within society and why we need to not allow it to change our society. But if you're talking about a very deep-seated fanaticism, ideological fanaticism that can lead people or is being used to justify acts of horrendous terrorism, then what can people do about it? What should societies be doing? How do we take it seriously? What does that look like practically going forward?
Practically, it means not turning a blind eye to these vicious crimes because you feel like doing so will be considered bigoted or Islamophobic or racist. And so you allow these things to slide. You know, the rape gangs all over the UK being a prime example of that. In my book, I talk about how, the court system in Canada let me down, saying, this is your culture, this is your family's religion, so therefore you must endure. They wouldn't say the same thing to another Canadian child if she was sitting there with blonde hair and blue eyes and complaining about the same things that I was. You know, there's this obsession with leaving us to be victimized. You know, FGM, that's another example. You know, people turn their, ignore FGM happening all over the UK, America, Canada, Sweden, France, et cetera, because they say, well, it's their culture and it's their religious right. But we all know that to take a razor to your daughter's genitals, anybody else who did that would be in a psychiatric ward, if not in prison. And so we have to start applying the same judgment to everybody, regardless of what their religion is or what culture they come from, is irrelevant. These are the laws, and it's one law for all. And that's something that I think is very important. And we miss that so much. We really get that wrong on so many different aspects.
I mean, in terms of a kind of wider problem within Western society, I mean, on this show and many shows on GBNews, we talk about free speech and oftentimes that kind of institutional cowardice. I mean, is it harder then, in a society more broadly that struggles to make defences of free speech and defences of Western values and universal values, then it becomes much harder to then challenge Islamist or jihadist viewpoints when in your own society more broadly you've lost confidence?
100%. I absolutely agree with that statement. That's exactly the problem, is that we're not even standing firm with our own values. And so therefore it's easy for people who are very steadfast in their values to insist that their way of life is better. And it's mind-boggling, especially if you take issues like feminism or anti-Semitism or homophobia, things that we've just barely overcome, things that we're just still dealing with the aftermath of. It's not like these are past issues. Yeah. And we're already allowing ourselves to go backwards because we don't want to offend Muslims or we don't want to, upset the feelings of anti-Semitic people or of homophobic people or of anti-woman people or of illiberal people. It just makes no sense. We have to stand firm with our values and our progress, be proud of it, and defend it.
Well, strong words. Thank you, Yasmin Mohammed, human rights campaigner and author of Unveiled. Thank you for your time. Well, in what has been described as the most comprehensive study yet into how the pandemic has reset global politics, research by the University of Cambridge has suggested that support for populism has collapsed around the world. The study found that a growing proportion of voters felt comfortable with having, quote, experts make decisions according to what they think is best. The researchers drew on surveys of more than 750,000 people across 109 countries and found that support for populist parties, agreement with populist attitudes, and the approval ratings of individual populist leaders had fallen sharply since the emergence of the coronavirus pandemic. Well, joining me now to discuss whether the pandemic has killed populism is Frank Frady, Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Kent and author of Democracy Under Siege, Don't Let Them Lock It Down. Thank you so much for joining me, Professor Frady. I mean, just to start off, do you think the pandemic has killed populism?
No, I think what the pandemic has done is it made a lot of people wary and scared about expressing their views. A lot of people have adopted a lockdown lifestyle. They have been forced to listen to what the experts and the scientists say, and they've been, to some extent, dispossessed of their capacity to act as citizens in public life because politics has been very, very abnormal in the last couple of years. But I think what this report shows is that although there has been a kind of reluctance to kind of promote full-blooded populist politics, the really interesting thing that it points out is that at the same time, in parallel with that, there's been a loss of faith in democracy. And I think one of the most disturbing features of this report is the way in which, in a sense, the fear of people to voice their aspirations has been paralleled by a kind of loss of faith, a loss of confidence in democracy being able to make life better for them.
I mean, what about some of the critiques of populism? I mean, some critics of populism would say that one of the reasons why it's been falling is that in times of crisis, it doesn't necessarily operate very well, that actually we do need authority from experts, we do need an expert class in situations of the unknown, like the pandemic. So what do you say to that criticism?
I think it's a false counterposition, because obviously we always need experts, but we don't need experts to work as amateur politicians. I think political decisions ought to be made by the people and by politicians after having listened to the experts. And it seems to me that what is being described here is not that somehow populism cannot cope with difficult circumstances. I think what it really sort of points out to is that at the moment, there's been a systematic attempt to depoliticize public life, to almost marginalize political discussion and political debate. And when that occurs, then you may have a temporary period at which people are more reluctant or less able to mobilize and demonstrate what they really want. But I'm absolutely certain that this isn't going to last for very long, because it seems to me that what you see throughout Europe and other parts of the world is a kind of slow-burning anger, a slow-burning desire to get back to the old normal, to somehow take matters into our own hands, and somehow, instead of just continuing with the present state where you're essentially treated like patients rather than citizens, to kind of embrace democracy in a full-blooded way. So I mean, they also argue, by the way, that populism comes into its own in a crisis situation. So they argue a lot of different things, but the only thing that unites their views is that they presumably don't like populism very much, because they're a little bit suspicious when the people speak out and when they take matters into their own hands.
I mean, why do you think populism has been demonised so much? I read an article by Jonathan Frieden in The Guardian where he described Brexit, which some people argue was partly populist, as a disease. I mean, why do you think that there is such a negative, sneering attitude towards populism?
Well, it's been going on for almost 2 centuries. And essentially, when people lash out at populism, what they're really lashing out at is the way that democracy works. They really feel that the majority should not be taken seriously because they're not as intelligent as the columnist that wrote this article, Jonathan Frieden. They think that people make wrong choices. And as a result, they believe that they should have a monopoly over political decision making. And I think that hostility, and it's more than hostility, it's almost a hatred of populism, is almost palpable. And when you talk to people, even now, about Brexit, or when you talk to people about different populist movements, they regard populist movements as somehow a lower form of human beings, that the people who vote for populist parties are not worthy of being treated with the same kind of respect as you would treat other people. And this hatred actually expresses a very strong hierarchical sense of superiority, looking down upon ordinary people, a kind of prejudice that if it was applied to, for example, different ethnic minorities would be called racism. But in this sense, what we're seeing is a kind of classism, what I call demophobia, the fear of the masses, that is the main animating force here.
And Frank, how do we go beyond this? Because, I mean, with the pandemic, you mentioned that it could actually be an opportunity with people reclaiming, a sense of their own democratic agency. But it does feel like the pandemic has torn people apart, made society much more polarised, been a huge transfer of power. It does feel quite pessimistic in some senses. I feel quite pessimistic when I think about the state of democracy right now. How do you think it can be reclaimed?
I think it's people like you and I and others who understand the importance of taking freedom and democracy seriously, to become a little bit more active and to try to find ways and means of bringing people together. I think what's very important at the moment is that people should understand that their voice, their desire to be part of a conversation in public life, is something that we all think is really quite important, because we trust the people. I think the question of trusting people is going to be our main slogan. So when we go out there the point that we make is not that we hate experts, we don't like scientists or whatever. The key point that we make is we trust people, we trust ourselves to do the right thing. And once we begin to popularize that idea, I'm certain that people's awareness or insecurity to get involved can be overcome.
And just finally, a quick question, because we've been discussing this on the show. I mean, is there any particular vehicle you think is the best vehicle, or one of the vehicles to which ordinary people, working class people, can organise for their interests? Because I think it's been quite interesting, for example, the Shropshire by-election, that a Leave voting seat voted Lib Dem because they perhaps felt disillusioned with both of the main parties, and we're seeing that sense of confusion about which party best represents ordinary people. It does seem that vehicle doesn't necessarily seem to be as clear right now as perhaps at other times.
I think you're right. I think a lot of people feel politically homeless. A lot of people that I talk to say, we need a new political party. And they kind of look around, and at the moment they're kind of desperately searching for a new party. And I think that's what is really needed. There's a number of parties that have emerged the last 2 or 3 years. We need to check them out, see which ones have the most serious people. I've spoken at party conferences organized by some of these new parties, and the thing that has really impressed me is the desire of the people that were there to make things happen, and the intelligence and the conviction that it is possible to create a new movement that can somehow change the way in which political life is conducted in our society.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Frank Furedi, Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Kent. Well, I hope you enjoyed this afternoon's show. That's all from us on the discussion. Make sure that you continue to tweet at the hashtag The Discussion. But we'll be back at the same time next week. But next up, it's Nano Queer. But first, here's the weather. Thank you. Goodbye.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking mostly dry but rather cloudy with some rain in the far northwest. Let's take a look at the details. The north coasts of Devon and Cornwall should see a few cloud breaks, but for most parts of southwest England, it will be a dry, albeit cloudy start to the evening. Southeast of England should also be generally dry at around 7 p.m, but here too it will be cloudy with light winds. There will be a better chance of some clear spells developing across parts of Wales, especially towards the north and west of the country. As we run eastwards back into the Midlands, the gaps in the cloud will tend to fill in, so any breaks will be restricted towards the west and northwest of the region. Slightly more in the way of a breeze is on the cards across the east of England, and this will help to break the cloud up a bit at times, giving some clear spells. Some damp and windy weather will affect the far north and west of Scotland, but further south and east a dry and breezy evening is likely with broken cloud cover. 1 or 2 cloud breaks are likely across Northern Ireland, particularly towards the north coast, but as elsewhere, the main theme will be a rather cloudy, predominantly dry one. Damp and windy weather will continue to affect the far northwest tonight. Elsewhere, it stays mostly dry and cloudy, with a slight frost forming under any clearer spells.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world.
If you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares